Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to The Breakfast Show on Faith FM. And last week, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, introduced to federal parliament our long-awaited Religious Anti-Discrimination Bill. We just want to congratulate Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the Liberal National Government for standing by their election promise to address the issue of freedom from religious discrimination in Australia. And in particular, the Attorney General, Senator Michaelia Cash, for her role in drafting the bill and presenting it to the government. Senator Cash joins us on the phone right now. Senator Cash, welcome to the show.
Lyle and Pastor Michael, it is fabulous to be here, and I just really want to say hello to all of your listeners.
Well, we're super excited to have you as well, and I should mention that, yes, Pastor Michael Worker is joining us. He is the Public Relations and Religious Liberty Director for the Adventist Church in Australia, and he's going to be sharing the interview with me. So, Pastor Worker, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lyle. A pleasure to be with you, and good morning to you, Michaelia.
Now, Senator Cash, I'm wondering whether we can begin by asking why this bill is necessary. I mean, Australia's functioned for over 100 years without a religious anti-discrimination bill, so why now?
It's a really good question. So I think, as we all know, Australia is a culturally and religiously diverse nation. In fact, we have over 14 million Australians who hold a religious belief. But as we also know, despite that, many Australians still experience discrimination on the basis of their religious beliefs in public life. And that just should not happen. You know, a Christian should not be discriminated against because they wear a crucifix around their neck, nor should a Jewish person who is told that they need to work on Shabbat. And that's why the Prime Minister did last week, and as you said, deliver on our election commitment to protect Australians from discrimination on the ground of their religious beliefs. But I think it's also important to point out, it also protects Australians who don't have a religious belief. The bill actually goes both ways in terms of the protections.
That's a fascinating point. Michael, I know you had some questions that you wanted to ask as well, so I'll let you ask a question at this time.
Yeah, thank you. And one of those real flashpoints, Senator, tends to be around faith-based education. And there are many Australians, many of our members who are deeply concerned about protecting the uniqueness of faith-based education in our very modern pluralistic society. What protection does the bill provide to ensure that faith-based schools can recruit and retain in employment who not only believe what the school believes, but also practice that belief?
Well, as you know, it is incredibly important, given the unique nature of religious bodies, and in this instance we're talking about religious educational institutions, to be able to give preference to allow people of the same religion as the religious body to be employed by them, if that's what they choose to do. And I think a lot of people forget that there are already exemptions in other discrimination legislation that already does this for faith-based institutions. So what we've done in relation to the Religious Discrimination Bill is ensure that faith-based educational institutions are given the ability to preference their own. And I think that's widely accepted across Australia. A Catholic school, if it so chooses, should be able to preference a Catholic person. A Jewish school, should they so choose, should be able to preference a Jewish person. That is already widely accepted in Australia, and this bill will continue those exceptions. What we have, though, done in this bill, Lyle and Pastor Michael, is this. If a religious education institution does want to rely on the exemption, what we've said, and I've been so pleased that religious education institutions have said this is good for them, is they will need to have a publicly available policy. And the publicly available policy will set out their ethos. So we're a Catholic school and we teach in accordance with the doctrines, tenets, beliefs of Catholicism. We will rely on the exemption, and we will rely on the exemption in this way. I think that is a really good step forward because I think it shows transparency. The school is being upfront in terms of what it teaches and how it teaches, but also for a prospective employee. I then know what the expectations are of the school. But again, as I said, as you and I know, Pastor Michael, there are already, in particular in the Sex Discrimination Act, there already are exemptions for religious bodies, and obviously they do include the religious educational institutions, and we will continue those exemptions in the Religious Discrimination Act, but in relation to preferencing on the basis of religion.
Yeah, so just following along from that, Senator Cash, there's been a whole bunch of, discussion in the media about the claims that the bill allows for LGBT students to be kicked out of schools. Is this true? And does the bill, override similar legislation already in place protecting LGBT plus people from discrimination?
No, it is not true. So what this bill does is fill a gap. So Australia already has, as you know, a Sex Discrimination Act, a Disability Discrimination Act, an Age Discrimination Act, and a Race Discrimination Act. However, there's no standalone legislation to protect people of faith. So that is what this bill will do. So consistent with other Commonwealth Anti-Discrimination Acts, it will make discrimination on the basis of a protected attribute, which will be the religious belief or activity, unlawful. But it does not override any of the protections in the other acts. So we recognise that freedom of religion is one right amongst many others, and as such, this right will coexist with other human rights. And importantly for your listeners, the bill will not allow discrimination on the basis of any other protected attribute, being age, disability, race, or sex. But very importantly, to go to your question about students, my fundamental belief and the Prime Minister's fundamental belief is that discrimination against students on any basis should not occur. And I've spoken to so many of the faith leaders, Lyle and Pastor Michael, and they have agreed with me. No student should be discriminated against on the basis of their sex. That's the overwhelming feedback. And I have to say, the experience from religious schools is that this does not occur. It is currently allowed, though, as you know, in the Sex Discrimination Act, not the Religious Discrimination Bill. That's got nothing to do with sexuality. The Religious Discrimination Bill is purely about religious belief and religious activity. But what I have done, I've written to the Australian Law Reform Commission, and as you know, they are actually already undertaking a review of all of the exemptions that religious bodies already have in discrimination legislation across Australia. So that's a big review across all exemptions, and they will report back to the government 12 months after the passing of the Religious Discrimination Bill on whether or not those exemptions are appropriate and still necessary. But I have made it clear the position of the government in relation to students, that it's the government's expectation that a student is not expelled from school on the basis of their gender or sexual identity. But I do again just want to make it clear to your listeners, the bill that we're talking about, that the Prime Minister introduced last week in the Parliament, this is about religious discrimination and discrimination as the protected attribute of religion.
Yeah, and I think that's really positive there to hear that. Now, Pastor Michael Worker, I understand that you wanted to ask a question in relationship to how this federal bill will affect the states.
Yeah, and just before we go there, Senator, certainly Adventist schools in Australia, and we have more than 16,000 students, we have an open enrolment policy, and we accept students of all faiths and even students of no faith at all. and that's been a guiding principle for Adventist education
Thank you.
for a very long
And
time.
I think that, yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I think some of the debate has unfairly focused on schools of faith and saying they would never do this, when, as you and I know, it's the exact opposite. This is exactly what schools of faith do. If you want to preference a teacher to be of your religion, that is, you should be able to do that. But when I actually talk to schools of faith, they take students because they're students. That's it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're here to serve the vulnerable, the marginalised, those who don't feel safe in other educational settings, and we want to welcome them in and give them a safe place to grow as humans, to have a values and faith-based educational experience. And many families find that very, very valuable in our Adventist education system. Look, I just want to talk about employment a little bit, because employment is largely a federal matter, the Fair Work Act. But what we're seeing is a number of states and territories are introducing or proposing changes to equal opportunity legislation that could undermine the freedom for faith-based organisations to preferentially employ people who not only say they believe, but they actually live out the teachings of their respective faith. Is there anything in this religious discrimination bill that might counterbalance those attempts to undermine these provisions?
It is a very, very good question, and the federal government's very, very clear position is that religious schools should be able to preference people of their own faith, if they so choose. Because I think, as you've pointed out, sometimes that's not what you'll do, but we believe that is incredibly important. So the state that you're currently referring to is the state of Victoria. And as you know, the Victorian government is, or has, not even is anymore, has introduced amendments to its Equal Opportunity Act. And what they're going to do, just to explain it to your listeners, is they're going to limit the existing circumstances where religious bodies and schools can discriminate in employment matters on the basis of doctrines, beliefs or principles of their religion. So in Victoria, what they want to do is say a religious body will only be permitted to discriminate against someone in employment on the basis of religious beliefs. This is the important bit. Where it is an inherent requirement of the particular role that the person be of the same faith as a religious body, and this is the important bit, this is an and, the requirement is proportionate and reasonable. Now, that is a severe limitation on your current protections, but what is worse, the court is now involved in telling you whether or not what you've done is proportionate and reasonable. Now, we think that is unfair. So what we will do in our religious discrimination bill is address those concerns, and we will provide, I think it's clause 11, that a religious education institution will not contravene a prescribed state or territory law, and in the event the Victorian legislation passes before our bill passes, it will be automatically added to our bill. So you will not contravene a prescribed state or territory law if the religious body has given preference in good faith to persons who hold or engage in a particular religious belief or activity in employment matters. Again, and we talked about the transparency before, to qualify for the exemption, the religious education institution, you must publish a policy setting out the relevant religious requirements for employment matters. It is very important, this particular clause, and as you know, it's a really serious issue when the federal government says we now need to override a state or territory law. This is not something that, as you know, we just do. It's a very serious step, but in this case, we believe the Victorian government has gone too far. We are fundamentally committed to the existing circumstances, again, supported by both major parties. For many, many years across the states and territories, we are fundamentally committed to the principle that you are able to give preference in good faith to persons who hold or engage in your particular religious belief or activity in employment matters.
And this is really important because this particular bill is of deep concern to us, and it almost puts the fundamental human right of freedom of religion as a second-class right in compared to other human rights. They're not being held in balance, and we want to strongly encourage you to be strong in this area.
And I would strongly encourage you then to call on, in particular, the Labor members of Parliament who will be voting on this bill in that regard, because that is the one thing that I've drafted this bill, as you know, very, very carefully. And what you've just said is consistent with the government's position. We recognise that freedom of religion is one right among many others. As such, this right coexists with other human rights, but it coexists alongside. We do not elevate and we do not de-elevate any other protected attribute. They sit alongside and complement one another. I think that is a very important point to make.
And as a faith leader, that's all we're wanting. We don't want to dominate. We don't want to say other human rights shouldn't be equal, but that there is an appropriate balancing of all the fundamental human rights so that we can all coexist together. We can all get along and continue to be a happy and harmonious society.
Well, I think, when you look at what we're actually doing, and people often focus, as you know, on the exemptions in the rule, the exemptions for religious bodies, religious educational institutions, which, as we know and we've discussed, these are not new. These are already in place. The Labor government supported them, and in fact in 2013, when former Attorney General Mark Dreyfus amended the Sex Discrimination Act to add in some additional protected attributes, the very important part of his speech was that the exemptions for religious bodies and religious schools that were already in the Sex Discrimination Act would be extended to include those new protected attributes. There is nothing new in what we are doing, and in fact it is a fundamental recognition that religious bodies should be able to practice in accordance with their doctrines, tenets and beliefs, because isn't that what you are all about? A religious community. I'm a Catholic. I went to Iona Presentation College back in Perth, Western Australia. I was educated by the Presentation Sisters, very strict convent school at the time. But it was all about being a Catholic, being part of a community, living as part of that community. That's the choice my parents made in sending myself and my brother and sisters to a strict Catholic school. That was their choice in the education. But I digress there slightly, because what the bill is actually doing, as we know, is actually protecting people from discrimination on the basis of their religion. So whether you're a Catholic, a Mormon, a Muslim, a Jew, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Baha'i, a Sikh, a Mormon, you can go on and on and on. This is about ensuring that you, as an Australian of faith, have confidence to be yourself, confidence in the country that you either grew up in or you came to because you knew it was a successful multicultural and multi-faith nation. Confidence that your government, we will protect you, we will protect your values. That's what this bill is doing.
Yeah, and Senator Cash, I think that's a really important point that you make there, because it's not just about, you and I, the three of us here, we're Christians, this is a Christian station, but this is about people of all kinds of different faiths. We've talked about Judaism, but we have, a very large Muslim community. We have, a Hindu community, we have Buddhist community, and, so many more. And this is protection for everybody, which is what we need. Now, for the benefit of our listeners, I'm just wondering whether I could toss out an example from the past to illustrate how this bill works. So back in 2015, we had the Tasmanian Roman Catholic Archbishop Julian Porteous, who was referred to the Australian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner for distributing a booklet to his parishioners and parents of his students in his schools defending biblical marriage. Now, would a person of faith in similar circumstances be protected by this new legislation?
Okay, so you're referring to what is known as the Statement of Belief Clause. And what we say is a person of faith, and not of faith, because I think, again, it's important to remind ourselves, this recognises that a person also has the right not to have a belief. You should be able to freely express your belief, talk about your belief, and as long as that statement of belief is made in good faith and you genuinely consider it to be in accordance with your faith, then all the bill does is say that statement of belief in and of itself is not discrimination, because a key aspect of protecting religious belief and activity is protecting the ability of individuals to explain, discuss and share their fundamental beliefs. But as you and I would both know, and as we would expect, there are, of course, limitations on the extent of the protection. A statement cannot be malicious. It can't threaten, intimidate, harass or vilify a person or groups of persons. But the ability to simply state in good faith what you believe, that should be okay. And it can't be discrimination, as you and I know, because discrimination entails an action. It entails conduct. If you and I are having a discussion in the workplace, or just generally here now, and just say, I'm an atheist, Pastor Michael and Lyle, and I say to you, well, guess what? Do you know, I know you believe in this concept of the afterlife. I think it's called heaven. I don't believe there is a God, so there can be no heaven. And then you say back to me, well, Michaelia, we're actually people of faith. We believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and we do believe that, you know, you will go to purgatory and then you will enter the gates of heaven. We should both be able to have this conversation. That's okay. We should be able to respect each other's views. We should be able to discuss and share our fundamental beliefs. Now, if I was to then say to you, though, I am now going to act on my belief as an atheist and discriminate against you because I don't share your belief, I think all of us would agree that's not okay. And that's what this clause says. Merely sharing, explaining your fundamental belief, as long as it's sincerely held, that's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's what we all want. We want, you know, a healthy society is a society that can have healthy discussions on all kinds of topics and be very broad and share ideas back and forth.
Now. Yeah, this is a healthy discussion and it's a good discussion.
Absolutely. Senator, I understand that not all of the recommendations of the Ruddock report are included in the bill. Why was that?
Okay, so I went out to consultation, as you know, and in fact this bill has been consulted on for a very, very long time. So when I came into the role as Attorney General, the Prime Minister said to me, Michaelia, I want to be able to now deliver on our election commitment to the Australian people. I want you to go and listen to all sides of the debate and bring a bill back to me that strikes the right balance between religious discrimination and intersecting human rights. And so I listened far and wide and I took on the feedback. So there were two clauses that the Cabinet agreed could be removed from the bill. And the first one was in relation to removing the provisions relating to conscientious objection. But we didn't just remove them. We listened carefully to the feedback. We accepted from the medical profession that the relevant codes of conduct do provide for conscientious objection. We accepted that the states and territories, when dealing in particular with abortion and euthanasia, provide for conscientious objection. And we also understood that if a medical practitioner felt they were not covered by the relevant code of conduct, they were not covered by the state and territory legislation, they can still bring a claim of indirect discrimination under the bill. We also agreed to remove the provisions relating to employer conduct but only on the basis that the existing protections for indirect discrimination, including in the workplace, will again already protect employees who face discrimination, and they can still make a claim in that regard. What we did say, though, was the provisions dealing with qualifying body conduct rules, they remain. Now, the reason they remain is because of the significant consequences if a person's professional registration or practice is restricted or removed as a result of the person's statement of belief being made. And we need to remember this, outside of their profession. It's okay to regulate me inside of the profession because I'm at work, but I should have the right outside of the profession to make a statement of belief in good faith. So that remains. But at the same time, the Christian and religious educational institutions came to us and they said a huge concern for us now is what Victoria is doing and what other states and territories are doing. That was not in the bill, as you know. So whilst, yes, we took out two provisions, we've also added in the additional provision to ensure that preferencing in employment is allowed by religious educational institutions. And that, for me, was one of the most fundamental parts of this bill, to be able to address what was a huge concern for religious educational institutions. So I think, and I've been so delighted with the response across the board from people. Most people, and in particular the faith leaders, and as you said, doesn't matter what denomination of faith you are, have come out and said it's a fair bill, it's a reasonable bill, didn't give us everything we asked for, but it absolutely strikes the right balance between religious discrimination, because that's what we are protecting. And as we've discussed several times now in this particular discussion, intersecting human rights.
And Senator, I think, I think that's fair. You know, a lot of the faith leaders I talk to, and my own personal view is, it would have been nice to go further. It would have been nice to see the provisions of ICCPR Article 18 enshrined in it, but despite some of those challenges, you know, we would support the enacting of this legislation. You know, we see it as a positive step forward for our nation, for people of faith, for people of no faith at all. Now, just honing in a little bit, this is a bill that protects people against religious discrimination. It actually doesn't necessarily provide positively for religious freedom. It's a protection against being discriminated against. But having said that, there are some elements in the discrimination framework that do provide some positive protections. Is there any comment you want to make about the distinction between providing for religious freedom as opposed to protection against discrimination?
Yeah, and I think it's a very, very important point to make, that anti-discrimination law in Australia is that. It is a bill that protects you from something as opposed to giving you a positive right to actually do something. So the bill that we've put forward broadly follows the same structure as existing federal anti-discrimination law, and will largely operate alongside, as we've discussed, other anti-discrimination law. But you are right, the bill does not introduce positive protections for freedom of religion. And that's because we recognise that freedom of religion is one right among many others. In practice, the right coexists with the broad suite of human rights. But in particular, when you look at the Religious Freedom Review, what it actually said, it itself did not support the enactment of a Religious Freedom Act, but it did support the enactment of a Religious Discrimination Act. So our bill implements the Religious Freedom Recommendation, and consistent with other Commonwealth Anti-Discrimination Acts, it makes discrimination on the basis of a protected attribute, which is obviously religious belief or activity, unlawful. And just in terms of, we talked about the ICCPR before. I mean, this is, as you know, It is a crucial aspect of protecting, freedom of religion, and recognises our obligation at international law to protect people from discrimination. It provides recourse for discrimination based on religious belief or activity. And at the same time, and I think this is very, very important, promotes understanding and awareness of the importance of religion to Australian society. And really, what are we fundamentally doing? Ensuring that people are able to hold and manifest their faith or lack thereof in public without interference or intimidation. That's the Religious Discrimination Bill.
Go for it, Michael. I heard you were about to say something.
And I think, to put it in a positive light, this has often been characterised as a shield rather than a sword, to use some populist language, that it doesn't provide an ability to attack others or to push others down, but it is just providing quite a reasonable framework, quite a solid framework of protecting people of faith from being marginalised, ostracised, discriminated against because of their faith, or, as you say, or their choice of having no faith at all.
And as we said, in its simplest terms, a Christian should not be discriminated against because they wear a crucifix around their neck. A Jewish person who's told, they need to work on Shabbat and they can't because of their religious beliefs, that's unfair if you can accommodate them. In its simplest terms, that's what the bill does. But it also says, in its simplest terms, if you're a person of faith or not of faith, you should be able to hold and manifest your beliefs in public without interference or intimidation. Isn't that what we believe in as Australians?
Absolutely it is. And Senator Michaelia Cash, I just want to thank you so much for joining us here on Faith FM and taking, so much of your very busy schedule to spend this time with us, explaining to us this new anti-discrimination bill. This is something that, as people of faith across Australia, we need to get behind. We need to give it all the support that we can. This is an important moment for Australia. We need to grasp the opportunity and give it as much support as we can. So, Senator Michaelia Cash, thank you so much for joining us.
And Lyle and Pastor Michael, I can just say it has been my absolute privilege to join you both this morning. So thank you for giving me the opportunity on behalf, in particular, of our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to have this really important discussion with you and your listeners.
You're listening to the Federal Attorney General, Senator Michaelia Cash, and Pastor Michael Worker, Director for Public Relations and Religious Liberty for the Adventist Church across Australia, here on The Breakfast Show this morning, talking about this incredibly important piece of legislation for people of faith. We're going to move on with the show right now. We will be back after the 8 o'clock news. You're listening to Faith FM.